What is tithing according to the Bible? Are we required to tithe as followers of Jesus? By the end of this, you'll know what the Bible really teaches about tithing and what we as followers of Jesus should think about the tithe. In Leviticus 27, verse 30, it says, "Every tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's." So tithing is primarily about what the land produces. It is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. Think of the tithe as the tax for Israel. Tithing is giving God a tenth. Tithe literally means a tenth. So to tithe means to give God a tenth of what He has given you to show your love for Him. So there are some things you and I need to know about the Old Testament tithe. Number one, tithing was a command for the nation of Israel because they were a theocracy, which means they were a nation ruled and governed by God as their king. Number two, tithing was commanded to support the Levitical priests. And these Levites, these Levitical priests, would minister to God in the tabernacle or temple on behalf of the rest of Israel. So it was Israel's contribution to that temple sacrificial system. Tithing was primarily about giving from one's own means to care for those who are serving and ministering as priests on behalf of the nation. So they kept the sacrificial system going, the Levitical priests, so they needed to be cared for since they were full-time ministering in that area, tabernacle and temple. Numbers 18 tells us this. Also, tithing was focused around the temple or the tabernacle because the temple was viewed as God's throne or His dwelling place among His people. It was like His throne room. And so the work and the service and the ministry that took place in between the Levites and God as king was on behalf of the nation of Israel. And so God could dwell among the nation of Israel because of the sacrificial system that He instituted. In other words, this is a huge deal to not just Israel as a theocracy, but to their identity as the children of God, that's the chosen nation of God. And so what we need to know about this tithe is that God is dwelling among that people, and the tithe was a part of the way to keep that going and to keep God's sacred space pure ritually and ceremonially. There's a bunch of things that need to happen in order for the sacred space of God to be dealt with and upkept. And so tithing, as we see, it was a requirement and not an option for the nation of Israel. If you want to be a part of the nation, this is your due. This is essentially how you contribute. It's necessary and it's required for the way God has set up this system. Tithing wasn't about money primarily. It was about the produce of the land. It was about livestock. These things were distinct from money. Silver and gold, they had their own currency, and the produce of the land and livestock was not the only form of monetary value. There were other things that they used to buy and purchase goods. Leviticus 27 verse 30 and Deuteronomy 14 speaks of the tithe. Tithes were also distinct from free will offerings according to Malachi chapter 3. In other words, there were things that you had to give to be a part of this theocratic nation, and then there were things that you could give freely on top of that just because you're so thankful and you love God and you're so appreciative. And so giving a tithe or a tenth was a concept for Israel, but also it was a concept for the patriarchs. Though it was different because there was no national entity, there was no Israel as a nation yet, we see patriarchs like Abraham and Jacob, centuries before the Mosaic law commanded the tithe for the nation of Israel. We see Abraham and Jacob giving a tenth of what they had acquired. They give it back to God. But it was not to keep up the temple system for the nation of Israel. It was different. And so tithes were given to the priests and Levites because they had no land inheritance. Other tribes in Israel had a land inheritance from God, but the Levites did not. And so the tithes were given to the priests and Levites as that's part of the way that God was their portion, was that He would give what came from the land of the other tribes to them. And so what was dedicated to God was dedicated to Him through giving to the priests and the Levites. Also, tithes were also required to meet the needs of the temple and its services. There's a lot that goes into keeping that system going in order for God to be able to dwell among His people instead of his sacred space being ritually defiled. And so 2 Chronicles 31 speaks of this. So when we jump to the New Testament, here's some things you need to know about the tithe. Jesus affirmed the principle of the tithe for the Israelites under the Old Covenant before his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. There is no command to tithe for the New Covenant church. For followers of Jesus under the New Covenant, there is no explicit command to tithe in the New Testament. Rather, it's actually, there's a level up version. It's ratcheted up. There's a command to be generous and give with a cheerful heart. 2 Corinthians 9 speaks of this. So instead of it just being a baseline amount of 10% or a tenth, it's give cheerfully, generously, which can well exceed that 10%. Also, there's wisdom within the principle of the tithe, which I'm all okay with, but it's not necessarily a commandment or a requirement for the New Covenant church. There's wisdom in this principle that is, hey, support God's work, care for God's people, be generous stewards of what God has given you because it's all his anyway. He's entrusted to you a degree of riches, so give to him and give to his work as you can and as he commands you to, as he leads you to by his Spirit, and do it cheerfully and generously. And so the tithe, or giving a tenth of our income, is not commanded in the New Testament for New Covenant believers. It doesn't mean we shouldn't. It's just, I'm saying it's not commanded. There's a lot of things we should do that aren't explicitly commanded. We don't just do things we're commanded to do. Sometimes we go above and beyond to show God our love and gratitude. And so this is not even a bare minimum standard. Some people view the tithe as, well, every believer should at least be given. There is no bare minimum standard. It's, hey, anticipate being generous. Prepare to be generous. Expect that God will lead you to give, sometimes very sacrificially and very generously. So we're to give whatever God says to give, whenever he says to give, to whomever he says to give, in order to advance his kingdom. And we should do that with a cheerfully generous heart. And so God still supports the work of his kingdom through the generosity of his people. But it is no longer a command to tithe. It is a command to support his work generously and happily. And this goes well beyond just the nation of Israel. No longer is it just about a specific place, a specific temple, a specific people. Now it's about, hey, God has generously given his Son to the world for the world and brought you into his kingdom by grace. So you extend that same generosity and love to others, whether it be believers or unbelievers. The principle and the wisdom of the tithe can apply primarily to money, but not only to money. We're to be generous, cheerfully giving with our time, with our abilities, with our skills, with our possessions, with our energy, with all the things God has entrusted to us in our sphere of influence. We should take the principle and the wisdom of the tithe and say, how can I use what God has given me to advance his kingdom, to invest into new creation? And so the wisdom within the tithe is to give God your best. Give God your first. Dedicate the best and the first of what he's given you, and dedicate it all to God, meaning I'm open to you, oh God, asking me to give any amount whenever. This is all yours. This is one of the ways we can express genuine faith and love for God, and gratitude is by giving cheerfully to his work in the earth. So again, just because we don't have to tithe, just because it's not a requirement and a command for New Covenant believers, does not mean we shouldn't tithe or shouldn't give God our first and our best. Some of us will be convicted to still give God at least a tenth. Some of us will stop at a tenth. But wherever God has you, what he's given you, be generous with that. Cheerfully give, even if it's above and beyond the tenth. Because we don't have to, we get to give. That's what tithing is really about. If you want the scriptures and the notes for this teaching, you can find those in the full free course for new believers on our website under Session 29, Tithing. Be sure to review the scriptures and notes before the next session and share this with anyone you think might benefit from this Spiritual Foundations course. Visit our website and I will see you in the next video where we address the question, what is fasting?